Au revoir monsieur. Au revoir monsieur.
Les gens sont parfois, je dirais, ce que j'appelle la transphobie intériorisée, c'est-à-dire qu'ils ne se rendent pas compte que ce qu'ils disent est déplacé.
On est là pour l'aider et pour lui montrer à quel point sa différence est belle.
Les hommes et les femmes ne sont pas traités de la même manière dans la société dans laquelle on vit, et il n'y a pas d'exception pour les trans.
Hello and welcome to a new edition. I'm Nadia Sharbi and this week we're putting the focus on the country's transgender community. Here in France, some 80% of people who identify as transgender say they've been the target of discrimination and violence. A worrying figure that's just the tip of the iceberg for these men and women caught in a double bind of administrative, medical and social obstacles and their dire financial consequences. Let's start with the first-hand account of two transgender citizens.
20-year-old Bambi doesn't open up easily. Like many transgender women, she's constantly faced with harassment and violence on multiple levels.
La transphobia au quotidien, je la vis
In my everyday life, I experience transphobia through the looks I get, through people's confusion when I walk down the street. You face the possibility of being verbally assaulted, beaten up and humiliated in public, and it often happens. I don't know if I feel vulnerable, but at any rate, I feel like I have absolutely no protection.
Black, transgender, woman. Each of these words alone carries a backstory of oppression.
Quand on est une femme transracisée, surtout moi je suis une femme noire.
When you're a trans woman of colour, especially for me as a black woman, our femininity is constantly called into question.
The school environment is no different. To ease her transition, Bambi has taken a break from her studies in fashion. Ocean went through his transition as an adult. He understands that for young people experiencing the same thing, the risk of dropping out of their studies is never far.
Young people live with transphobia through school and university. They're misgendered. They haven't necessarily been able to change their first name, their identity papers. It's so distressing and difficult that they drop out. That's why we see fewer transgender graduates.
Ocean is the first French artist to publicly claim his trans identity.
Chère famille, je suis née assignée fille. Vous le savez peut-être ou peut-être pas, mais je n'ai jamais réussi à être parfaitement heureuse dans cette identité.
An actor, director and scriptwriter, he filmed his transition for over a year.
Comme je passe dans une autre catégorie, je serai un homme, je serai un homme, mais je serai un homme trans.
Je ne serai pas un homme. Tu ne seras pas un homme, tu ne seras pas mon fils.
Bah si.
Non.
Je serai quoi alors?
Tu seras trans.
In his documentary, he reminds us that transphobia is everywhere, even in the medical sphere.
With doctors, we're sort of at their mercy. With police, too. Everyone comments. Complete strangers come up to us to ask what we've got in our pants. It's as if our bodies were at other people's disposal. It's extremely intrusive and aggressive. Sometimes it can make us feel isolated, worried, or socially anxious.
Fighting against this widespread discrimination is part of Bambi and Ocean's daily lives. This means making their voices heard to raise awareness over and over again, explaining that transphobia is deadly. In 2019, 587 transphobic attacks were recorded in France, a figure which has more than doubled in just 1 year.
For more on how France treats its transgender community, I've come to meet sociologist Emmanuel Beaubatie, who's written extensively on this issue. Emmanuel, hello.
Hello.
Thank you very much for being with us. And now when discussing transgender issues, using the right words, names and pronouns is hugely important. Let's start with that word of transgender. In France, as elsewhere, it's come to replace the word transsexual. Why?
The word transsexual first appeared in the 50s in a medical context. From its inception, it was a clinical term. Then, in the 90s and 2000s, as a result of the trans community's activism, a new terminology started to emerge to take this condition out of the medical field and remove some of the stigma that goes with a medical approach. And that's how the idea of trans identity first appeared, as well as the shorthand trans and the word transgender, so the people in question could reclaim the words that describe their experience.
Now, the outcome of all these administrative, medical and social obstacles is that most transgender people face massive financial difficulties. How can that be addressed?
The cause of this financial hardship is mainly institutional. First, it comes from the number of difficulties in applying for a change of sex on France's civil registry. You need a number of testimonials and official documents, and the worst-off applicants simply don't have access to such proof, precisely because they depend on updated official documents to access things like work or a lease, so it's a vicious circle. Another instance is the medical assistance that's offered to trans people, both in France and elsewhere, because it's based on a psychiatric approach. Now, to access medical support, you have to go through a 2-year-long psych evaluation. So it's often during that lengthy waiting period that people face economic hardship, especially if they don't have job stability before they start transitioning. Because finding a job during that transition process is almost impossible. So it's that lasting discrepancy between a person's gender expression through their pronouns and physical appearance and the gender recorded on their official documents that leads to such poverty.
Now, more often than not, the media, for instance, tend to focus more on transgender women rather than transgender men. Is that significant, or is their experience of transition the same?
Usually the transition experience for transgender men and women is very different and mostly comes down to how society responds to what I'd call their respective gender transgression. So when men start transitioning towards becoming a trans woman, they face immediate stigma and violence. Whereas in the case of a woman transitioning towards becoming a trans man, the social response is to downplay the situation, put it down to their being a tomboy, at least at first. As a result, data shows that poverty levels are higher for trans women than for trans men, and the latter also enjoy far more support from their loved ones, including their parents. So there's a clear difference depending on the gender you're transitioning to. That difference also translates in the age at which men and women begin the process. With transgender women, who are the target of a lot of violence from the onset, many give up on seeing the process through, temporarily at least, and try to fall in line and go back to living as men. Then they'll make the transition later in life, usually in their 50s. On the other hand, transgender men all make the transition in their mid-20s.
Well, the impetus for progress might actually come from an unlikely source, the country's youth. In the wake of a number of high-profile stories in the US, the question of transgender children has come to raise awareness here in France, most recently with the case of 8-year-old Lily and her fight for recognition.
8-year-old Lily is an energetic child from the south of France. But she hasn't always been so comfortable in her own skin. Lily was assigned as a boy at birth. Last year, she went through a bout of depression.
You used to shout a lot and cry at night.
Yes, I was angry.
So much so that her parents became increasingly alarmed.
One night she finally managed to tell us why she felt her life was so worthless and what she'd like to do to make it worth living. For us, it was a huge relief. At least we now know what makes her feel this way, so we'll do everything to make her feel better.
The first step for the family was to make their daughter's school accept her gender expression and her new name. Lily's school responded by sending a therapist to observe her in the classroom.
She's there to look at how much it makes me suffer when someone calls me by my old name.
And you found that hard?
Yes.
To avoid these kinds of painful experiences, France's Education Ministry has launched a working group to come up with guidelines for transgender issues. For Lily, her life is much easier since her school has accepted her chosen name and pronoun.
We're lucky with Lily, as she's proud of who she is. She wants to go to rallies and say it loudly. We're trans and we're allowed to exist. For us, it's made us think a lot about gender in general. Basically, we're here to help and show her that difference is beautiful. That she's beautiful.
Lily's parents reached out to LGBTQ+ charities to listen and learn. and to provide her with information as to not push her towards or away from medical interventions. They've signed her up at a Parisian clinic should she wish to take puberty blockers. But what's most important for the family now is to win a legal battle for the state to recognize her new name in official documents.
Emmanuel Beaubatie, how is France doing in comparison to other Western nations on these issues?
Alors, elle se positionne pas à l'avant-garde, il faut le dire.
Let's be honest, France is far from being a leader on these issues. But to be fair, on the medical front, few countries offer a different approach. As a rule, it's still viewed as a psychiatric issue. However, on the key question of changing one's gender on official documents, some countries have instated a system that no longer involves a court of law. For instance, in Argentina, since 2012, people can change their sex on the country's civil registry by simply applying at the town hall. In France, you can change your first name at town hall, but the change of sex still has to go through the country's high courts.
Relève toujours du tribunal de grande instance.
Emmanuel Beaubatie, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And with that, we leave this edition. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned to France 24.